Hey everyone, maisth here. Welcome to the very first video of an exciting new series, where I'll be taking you behind the scenes of a game I've been creating with my team since January 2025. Now for me, this just isn't any game. This is a project born from passion, desire, a culmination of all the experience I've obtained along the years working as a game dev, or a 3D artist for that matter. In this video, I'm going to share what the game is all about, how the idea came to life, the journey we've taken so far, and of course, the many unexpected challenges we've run into, and also how we tackle them one by one. So, whether you're here for a game dev inspiration, behind the scenes insights, or just want to follow the making of something awesome from the ground up, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. To begin with, I'm gonna be explaining what this game will be about, so you can understand what you're gonna be seeing in this video. This game starts with a basic concept. What if every time you enter an arena, you had to rely on fate to determine your weapon? That's how Empress Coliseum came to be, a fast-paced first-person shooter roguelite where you fight through relentless waves of enemies, harnessing the power of magic crystals. These artifacts transform into random weapons, power-ups, or vital resources that can be used by the player. But there's a catch. Each crystal is limited and single use. You can store a few in your inventory, but most importantly, you can only wield one at a time. This forces you to adapt and strategize on the fly, making each encounter a unique challenge. We wanted to introduce an element of unpredictability to the roguelite experience. Instead of having a stockpile of weapons to choose from, you need to make the best of whatever the arena provides, whether it's a new weapon or a much needed boost. Imagine facing a wave of enemies with only a fleeting power-up to rely on and a weapon that maybe is not the best one suited for such encounters. The thrill here lies in your ability to adapt to the unexpected and make do with whatever you have at your disposal. And while that's a core concept, for the gameplay, we also wanted to immerse players in a setting inspired by dark fantasy and Gothic themes. So now that you have a more defined idea of what kind of game this will be, next up is to talk about the development of Empress Coliseum. Now, the development of this game started out in early January. At this point in development, it was just me, who had a desire of making a game in 1 year and then releasing it on platforms such as Steam, itch.io, and others that could garner enough visibility for it. Obviously, this changed a bit in the upcoming weeks, but the idea still stands even today. Make a game in 1 year and then hopefully release it. I'll talk more about the team and who's doing what later. So, how does this actually start? Well, with the documentation, of course. The first thing I actually started to document was the gameplay, how it could play out in a roguelite type game. The idea was always the same, a roguelite game that takes place in an arena where you have a limited arsenal of weapons that you could use at any time. One key point for this was making the game take place in a coliseum, or arena for that matter. This concept was actually born from a gameplay standpoint rather than a story one. If you have played roguelike games, then you know that level proceduration plays a big part in such games. Their strongest point is making each run feel different from the last. With this game, that concept is retained, but not in the same conventional way. The main inspirations for this game were Hades and Enter the Gungeon on the roguelite aspect. For the setting and world building, it was Elden Ring, believe it or not. 1 year of work for this game can only give you so much. So with the whole proceduration of the levels, I had to downsize it a bit. So the idea was to have already designed layouts for levels, but which one they could appear in your run would actually be random, kinda similar to how Hades does it. Add to this that the enemies that can spawn are also random, and then you have a game that does have random layouts, but not in a complex way. The rest of the documentation follow, such as seeing the story and world building of the game. This is still in development, of course, but when it came to the setting, one that I really wanted to develop for a while was a dark fantasy Gothic setting, something more bleak and dark. Most of my previous games that I've worked on had a more sci-fi or modern day setting to them, so with this game, I was really throwing myself into the unknown. But how could I resist when some of my favorite games had this cool aesthetic like Thief, Skyrim, and Age of Empires. Okay, maybe some of them are not dark fantasy or gothic, but you get the gist. Dark Ages or medieval type games, where the weapons, clothing, and type of world is not like today. These types of games, and especially this type of medieval setting, bring out a sense of adventure, a feeling of immersing yourself in a world that could still be unknown to most. Which is exactly what I wanted with this game. Even though the game only takes place in a Coliseum, I'm making sure that the world building, story, and characters all feel authentic to the world we're creating. I compile a lot of references to make this happen, from the type of setting, to the art style, to even how the characters should talk. This all helped to make the story make sense and be as best as it could be. And speaking of story, a very important pillar to this game is the narrative. Even though this is a roguelite type game, the plans is to have something similar to how Hades does its story, with characters talking to you in a hub-like area or sometimes in the run, progressing their dialogues and learning more about the world that way. Now, I will touch on the story briefly, since if I spoil it, then why even play the game, right? The brief story of this game is this. You play as Servan, a person classified as cursed, a sick prisoner, who is used as entertainment in the Moon Coliseum, in which you fight against other cursed people or monsters that you have the objective of eliminating to survive another day, all with the purpose of obtaining the freedom that the Empress, creator of this horrible game, swears to give. The story of the game follows the protagonist, Servant, who has one objective, to be free from the Coliseum. While the story is still under development, in terms of character, the most important ones are obviously the protagonist, whom we'll be able to tell more in the upcoming devlogs, and also the Empress. The Empress is the antagonist and villain of the story. This character was actually the first one that was written. I knew we needed to have a striking character whose presence will be felt, regardless of not being the protagonist. The Empress fills that role. The design for the story of this character and how she should be and act were numerous, but we eventually got to this design, which I think does give an empowering feel, especially when you look at her in the game, which we'll talk about soon enough. There's also a lot of other things in the document like weapon stats, types of enemies, reference, and what else, but I can only show so much before spoiling the whole thing. Now we get to my favorite part, showcasing what we got for the models, animations, programming, and even the music. Yes, we got a composer for this game. It's that serious. So let's see these other parts now. Before diving deep into the visuals of the game, I want to introduce the main artists working on the art department for the game, just so you know who did what, and also for me to thank them by mentioning them in this video. To start off, first Santino, our 2D and concept artist, Daniel, our 3D character artist, Saurabh, our texture painter, Joshua, our 3D artist and texture painter, and Ken, our 3D animator. These 5 individuals right here are the reason this game, visually speaking, is looking so advanced right now. They joined a while after I started development of this game, and without them, this game wouldn't be the same, honestly. And I'm thankful for everything that they've done in this project. Many thanks to you guys. We're gonna start out first with the visual area, as I feel this will quickly tell you how the game will look like and the type of art style we're trying to achieve. First is knowing what type of visual style we want to achieve. The main reference in terms of setting, color palettes, and even structural design was Elden Ring. This game is incredible, not only in its gameplay, that's hard as but also in its world building, setting, and even character design. It was the perfect reference to have. We wanted to combine something similar to this, but with a more stylized touch, borrowing techniques from anime, and also making sure it felt like a dark fantasy game, with dark colors, grotesque designs for some characters, and a world that whenever you looked at it, felt bleak. To give you an example, this is how the Coliseum, the main area of the game, is looking right now. And this is how it started. Yeah, I know, it looks bad, but that's because this was a placeholder design. Some of the things you're gonna be seeing in these images or videos are placeholder, like the Roblox type enemies, the untextured hands, those are just placeholder elements that hopefully will be somewhat reduced in the upcoming videos or screenshots. An important part of this game is the combat, and well, it's a medieval type of game, which means no modern weapons. So many of the weapons you'll be using will be melee weapons and sometimes ranged ones. Here's an example of the weapons we'll be having. Things like swords, maces, daggers, bows, crossbows are just a tiny example. Each one of these weapons will feel unique to use, and also fun to just hit an enemy in the face with it. Also, they look amazing. All of the weapons in the game were modeled and textured by Joshua, who did an incredible job with it. It took a while to get to this point of making sure the weapons felt right in this game, but we eventually got there. Even though this is not finished yet, we're still working on making sure the first person aspect of the game works well. As you can see, initially it was just a good old cube for the hands, then we switched to a model of a hands that represent, well, the hands of the protagonist. These are untextured, but they serve the purpose of showing how the animation should look like, how far from the camera they will be, and most importantly making sure to know the scale of the weapons we model. In this case, the models for the hands were made by me. But to have weapons also means to have enemies, right? Correct. Which is important also to show how the enemies of the game will look like and came to be. This was a collaborative process between Santino and Daniel. Santino mainly created the concept art for them, and then Daniel modeled them from the ground up. Sometimes some issues could arise, like for example maybe the concept art could not show everything in detail, but we resolved that with a quick communication and meeting. And speaking of textures, the textures for things like the environment and even characters were done by Saurabh and Joshua, who also did an incredible job with all this. We of course ran into some complications at times, and at the beginning we were experimenting on how the textures could be done, but I think the end result is honestly very nice. It's not 100% realistic, but it's not 100% cartoon either. A semi-realistic approach to the art style, and I'm quite happy with how it's looking right now. The Empress was the only character that I model and texture, mainly to find this nice in between of the textures for the environment and the characters. But while I model it, there's also another person doing an incredible job in the animation, and that's Ken. And he's animated characters like the dog, with a full set of animations for walking, attacking, etc. Really amazing job. And this is just a small example. In this case we have the Empress, now she may look like when fully animated. It looks really nice. Now all this that I show is just a small piece of what's actually being done. But I don't want to drag this too much. And so now we're gonna get to an important yet often scary part of game development. Programming to me is many times a love-hate relationship. On one side, I enjoy writing code and seeing how the thing I'm trying to achieve comes to life. On the other hand, yeah, that's programming in a nutshell to me. Even so, it's the most important aspect of a game. Without this, there's no game. Without me showing you how the game has evolved since its inception, this will be a nice showcase of different assets we've made so far. But that's not the case. So let's dive in. For this game, I started programming it on Unity 6. Mainly because it had some advancements on optimization, lighting probes, that sort of thing that will really help in this case, since for the most part, this game will not be using real-time lighting or shadows, but mostly baked ones, ensuring that the levels and everything looks as good as possible without taking in much performance. The first thing I actually started to do was create a simple scene like this, and I actually started adding some player controllers to control the player, obviously. I experimented with different controllers, since I wanted to have one that was already good enough for basic things like moving, jumping and other things, but could be upgraded further if necessary. Which is why I eventually got to this player controller right here. I'm gonna leave a link in the description, it's from this fellow. Really good script, I must say. It's all documented well and very well thought out. Other things included experimenting with player or enemy health, that sort of thing. For the player, I wanted to implement not only a health system, but a shield system, so he could block incoming attacks and have it take damage on the shield instead of the health. Now, this was all cool, but eventually I needed to program the most important part of this game, the combat. Since in this game the idea is to have multiple weapons, I decided to use scriptable objects for saving up the data of the weapon stats. If you don't know, scriptable objects are basically containers of data that can be used to obtain from or even modify in real time. It's a more organized way of saving up things like the stats of a weapon, as you can see here. I did have to make a complex scriptable object since there were two types of weapons you could use, melee and range. So now I can save up data like the damage, range, and even choose if it's a melee or ranged weapon. And that way my stats can also change and the data I can put. I think now it's a good time to mention that I'm using some varied assets for this project. I'm gonna leave this here just so you know which ones I'm mostly using, but they were a huge help in speeding up the process for making the prototype and quickly testing things out, especially Odin Inspector and Emerald AI. These came in a clutch. Now for the combat itself, I decided to use a raycast for the melee one and just spawn in a prefab for the range one. So the melee one I'd say is the most interesting, since like I said, I decided to use a raycast to check on the enemies. The cool thing with this is that since it's linked to the weapon data from the scriptable object, depending on the weapon, the raycast box can change dynamically. So a spear weapon would have much more range than a dagger, for example. Of course, this will require some balancing to know which weapon needs how much, but it's a really handy system to have. And here we can see a demonstration of the fist weapon and how it changes to a sword one. See how the raycast changes? Pretty cool, huh? Another cool thing I wanted to add was weapon swaying. I used this cube as an example, and you can see how it works. This will later translate into the hands, of course. And between creating the player HUD, which looks like total crap now, since it was just used for testing, another important element to program was the magic crystals, the main mechanic and what makes this game unique in the roguelike aspect. I first made the crystals as an object, positioning them, making sure they looked like something. Then I went right ahead on creating the scriptable object for them, so I could put them in a much more organized way of holding them data. So in these demonstrations you can see how the crystals are made. They have a random type of object, be it a weapon or a power up or a sustain object. For now I mostly created weapons to test them on the raycast. And here if I pick up this crystal, it gives me a mace. I even added a circle HUD to signal when its cooldown for appearing another crystal will happen. Now I want to move on to the player. I talked briefly how I just used a player controller that already existed and then modified it. Well, the end result is looking something like this. At this moment I even made some quick animations for the hands so I could actually test every mechanic that the player would have, but with a more visual component, and it's slowly taking shape. Moving on to a small but cool thing, which is the dialogues. I mentioned earlier that we are using the asset called Unity Dialogue System. Well, here you can see me testing it and seeing how it works with what we got so far. The arena, the Coliseum. How are we gonna be spawning the enemies? Well, like this. Bruh. At least it's a testing for spawning. And you can see how it's stacking them up. The reason this is happening was because they're not moving and they are spawning way too fast. This was intentional to further test this script, because this script was a pain in the ass. There's a hefty amount of variables that control the type of enemies that will spawn, how many in a wave, if it affects the difficulty in case the player is having trouble, that sort of thing. Now I'm gonna be closing this section of the video with the following videos or elements that we continue developing. The reason? This video is long enough, and if I show you more, we'll be here for 20 more minutes. Other cool things that we made are a radar system to check if an enemy is close to you, similar to games like The Last of Us. Bettering the game feel, so when you punch an enemy it actually feels like it's being hit, with things like shaking the camera, recoil movement, or even freezing the game a bit. I even implemented some rudimentary cloud physics system on the Empress. It's very early, so there's some problems with it, but we'll get through it. Blocking and parry mechanics, so it actually feels like you have a chance at defending yourself instead of just dodging. And small things like when your shield gets broken, there's a notification for it so you don't miss it. All of this is in service to having a much better designed combat system, with the player having tools at his disposal like dashing, sliding, parrying, blocking, and actually having a fight with an enemy. See here how he dodges or blocks at a certain times? We're almost there with the combat system in this game. Almost there. Now it's time to talk about one last important piece to any game. The music. In this case, I'm not going to be talking about it, but our composer himself will. So I'll leave him to explain bits and pieces about the process of making the soundtrack for this game. Take it away, Nukro.
Hi everyone, I'm Nukro, and I'm the composer for Empress Coliseum. Today I've been given the privilege to show you all one of the tracks that I have created, and I thought I would show you one of my favorites. So without keeping you all here too long, here is a snippet from the ambient theme for the hub area of the game. So I hope you all enjoyed that little piece of music. The idea that started the ambient theme was I was told the hub is more of a prison to the player. So when I went into this, I wanted to create a piece that felt very contemplative, and it sent the idea to the player that this isn't exactly supposed to be a home area. It's more supposed to be a place where the only thing you can really do is get your bearings and prepare. Now obviously this did come with a few challenges. I did struggle a lot with conveying emotion properly when creating this track, and one way I did that is by, for context, when you play the game you'll notice there are two elements very present in the soundtrack, and it's going to be orchestral elements and electronic elements. I'm not going to spoil what those represent, you'll have to play the game to find out, but this track is purely acoustic and it helped a lot in trying to properly tell the player the kind of situation they're in. I want to end off my segment by saying that I'm extremely grateful to have the opportunity to be working on this, and everyone has been absolutely amazing. I don't think I have learned as much in composing as I have until I started working on this game, and I just want to give a big thanks to everyone. It means the world to me, and I can't wait for you all to hear the soundtrack when it finally comes out.
And we've arrived at the end of the video. With this first step locked on, I'm gonna start to be more active in social media. In fact, we have created some specific accounts for this game. So if you could follow us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and other pages, it would help us a lot. Links are in the description. If you enjoyed this first devlog and want to see more, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about what you think so far. Also, if you have any suggestions or ideas, we'd love to hear them, so reach out through our social media. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.